Michael Linehan from Zero Waste Scotland. My question was for John about the carbon footprinting work. So obviously it's great that we've got a carbon footprint, and SC Link has suggested that we could have a carbon footprint target, and that would really start to hone in on the exported or outsourced impacts that we have here in Scotland. But I've also heard from people working closely on that project that the data is not sufficient, or there's too much uncertainty involved to accurately target those emissions, and so there's nervousness around setting such a target. Do you, working on it directly, do you feel that's accurate, and do you think it's too uncertain to set a target at this time?
Yeah, no, I don't. So we've done a really sort of quite sophisticated Monte Carlo simulation analysis, which works out uncertainty by replacement of each variable in the model and then seeing how much that affects the overall result. There's over 1 billion data points in the whole model, so we found that it's constrained by enough variables to give an accurate account. So what I might mean by that is we tie the territorial emissions obviously to Scottish territorial emissions. So at that level we accept the uncertainty associated with those calculations. Our analysis showed an extra sort of 4 or 5% uncertainty arises from territorial to consumption-based accounting. And to me, the amount of uncertainty around things like land use anyway, and the emissions associated with that are so great that you're dealing within the realms of possibility in terms of calculating it. So they could be better, I totally acknowledge that. And one of the problems we have with Scotland in particular is that Scotland doesn't know how it trades with England. So it has its own kind of input-output tables, but doesn't have that tradable relationship in place. So therefore, we have to make assumptions on carbon efficiencies for the UK quite often. So some improvements around ensuring that certain elements where there are differences could be done. So improvements can be made, but for me, nothing is beyond a realm of uncertainty, which doesn't mean that a target could be set, and it's definitely certain enough to drive actions around it, in my opinion.
Okay, yes, Richard. Just on the ecological footprint itself, so I showed that graph going upwards and just going into overdraft, and that's where 3 planets comes from. That's quite a well-developed methodology. It's changed a bit over the years, and you can argue about what should be in and what should be out and how accurate the numbers are. The bottom line of it is it doesn't really matter whether it's 3.2 planets or 2.8. It's still quite a lot more than 1. So it is an indicator which is showing you need to make a very big difference. And to set targets for Scotland, as I showed you, the Netherlands have set targets, and I was frank about the fact that they didn't really know what the full numbers were when they set those targets, and they're working on that now. So we can do that. That's not what we chose to do for climate change. We took very expert advice about what the target should be, and again, you can argue lots about that data and what the ambition should be and where you're aiming and all sorts of things. But we did have lots of data in front of us. So when we say that the circular economy bill should have targets, ideally it should have targets on the bill, and we agree those targets and then we get on with it. We might decide, the committee might advise, the government might suggest, we NGOs might have that discussion. We might say, well, clearly we need targets, clearly we need big, tough targets, but we're not quite in the position to set them just now. We need to do a bit more work. So in that case, you can see our circular economy bill that we passed, which says within 5 years or within 3 years, there's a duty on Scottish ministers to set targets. But that gives time to do a bit more work on the data. And there are lots of things happening on data, so every year we know more and more. So we are pragmatic in saying that it might be that we can't yet set the targets. We would like to. We would like to know what the direction of travel is and how fast we're going to go. But if we can't quite do that, you can certainly ensure that that does happen within 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Okay, Mark Rascal.
Yeah, okay, I had a quick question for John. It was around the food production. 60% of those emissions being generated outside of Scotland. I wondered if that incorporated the feed that comes to Scotland to obviously, rear livestock under intensive conditions, and whether that captures that whole, food component. component of consumption-based emissions. But the other point I had was just around incineration as well. And it was interesting to hear, you know, about CETA in France and Veolia, you know, very, very well-known companies in this country as well. And what we are seeing in Scotland now is a real rush of applications for incinerators coming from many different companies, and really no kind of understanding of, you know, what kind of incineration capacity, if any, we actually need to deal with residual waste. I mean, hopefully none, but, you know, there isn't really a direction or a planned capacity there that's coming from any kind of planning system from government. So I'm just sort of interested again in what the panel would think about incineration. I mean, from my point of view, got like to ban any more of it. You've obviously tried that in France, not quite got there in terms of the provision within your bill, but I'm wondering, you know, incineration tax, we tax landfill, should we be taxing incineration as at the same level or slightly less level? Is that a possibility? Is that something we should be pushing for in our bill if we're stopping short of a ban on further incineration?
So on the first bit, yes, it's completely taken into account, and in the accounts we provide to the Scottish Government, that food is broken down, I think, into about 10 categories, and it clearly shows that meat and meat products, including dairy products, are the majority of that impact by quite a large margin. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but it's a significant proportion of that, and all the feed is taken into account within it, along with the complete supply chain associated with that. So that is there. I'll just very quickly say something on the second one, and that is, it seems to me there's a role for government here to foreclose options to drive the innovation needed in other sectors. And I think there's often a slight tendency with policy to try and do everything. So you do good things like renewable energy, but you don't stop the bad things. And so therefore you get a situation where you are both becoming more and less sustainable at the same time. And unless the whole crisis to me is not just about doing the right thing, it's stopping doing the wrong thing at some point. And you are in essence holding back all the sectors of a low carbon economy that you want to develop by insisting on not necessarily foreclosing those options. So that's where the tough decisions need to be made, and I would put incineration into that group.
I would absolutely agree. Yes. The French government is saying it doesn't want to ban anything. So for instance, there's mechanical biological treatment of municipal waste in France. They use it to make compost. They kind of filter out the organic bit and pretend it's compost and put it on the land. And at one point, the government almost banned it, but they just didn't. They just said, just avoid it. Which of course doesn't hold up in any kind of court of law. So there is a lot of problem with the taxes too. In France, we've had an incinerator tax for a long time, but for landfill, when it was about €30. For incinerators, it was officially €12, but actually, because there were exemptions and reductions, it was down to about €5 per tonne, which is just nothing. I mean, and the French government's idea, for some reason, has been just to make incineration the same price as landfill, which I've never understood why quite they want to do that.
Do you think there's a level where it could be set at which would disincentivize incineration? If it was, say, €40 a tonne?
Incineration should cost a lot more than recycling, but at the moment there's lots of things that are not recycled because people say, oh, it's too expensive to recycle, it's much easier to burn it.
Richard, do you want to come in?
Yes, I've been following the incineration debate in Scotland for a long time, and about 3 years ago a journalist had done an audit of all the planning applications around Scotland, and there were about, I think it was 14 proposed incinerators, and he asked me for a quote. So I looked at the same quote I'd given the same journalist 10 years earlier about 14 incinerator applications, because we were in a phony incineration phase where they were not quite viable, so lots of people had proposals, but none of them actually proceeded. But since then, lots of them have proceeded, and we've kind of not noticed. And so there are lots of incinerators being built, are in commissioning, or are just about to be fully up and running in Scotland. And the biggest way I pinned this down was about 7 years ago. I was at a presentation at Polmadie, which is the big waste treatment plant in Glasgow, and we asked the question, when you have built this plant, and it had rather a troubled history but it's now up and running, when you've built this plant and you're taking in the black bags and you're smashing them up in the thing and you're getting some stuff out for recycling and then lots of it's going for recycling, what is the maximum efficiency of recycling that this plant will have? And the answer was 40%. So Scotland's currently under 50%, but Glasgow will always be at 40%. Our target for 2020 is 60%. Glasgow will be 40%. Our target for 2025 is 70%. Glasgow will be 40%, because we've built that thing and it locks us in to never achieving what we should achieve. And that's the danger with incinerators. We probably should have some incineration capacity. There are probably some materials where it is perfectly sensible to incinerate them and recover some energy at the end of life. But if you think about what is it that burns well that's in the municipal waste stream, well, it's plastic, which we should be recycling. It's paper and cardboard, which we should be recycling or composting. So actually the things that you need to keep in the waste stream, particularly plastic, because it burns really well, you should actually take them out and do something more sensible with them. And if you build an incinerator, the only way to make it pay, to make the business case work, is that of course it's got to make electricity, which means every day it's got to be running at full tilt to make enough electricity to make the business case work. So once you've built it, it's not as if you've got reserve capacity. Oh yeah, this week we need to run our incinerator a bit because we've got some stuff. You've got to run it 100% all day, every day, all year. So that's the danger we are sleepwalking into, and it's very frustrating. And whenever I've raised it with senior government civil servants, they raise their eyes to heaven and say, oh yes, isn't it frustrating? Well, hang on, you're the government. And you, Mark, you pointed out exactly the problem. There is no strategic view about how much incineration we should have and how it should be distributed around Scotland. It's as a market free-for-all. If you put it in and it gets through planning, there's another 100,000 tonnes.
Just to add to that, does it work when I speak? Anyway, you can hear me. Oh, right. I hope you could hear me. Yes, in France, if you want to build an incinerator, there's a public inquiry. I imagine there is. We have tried. I think we have sometimes succeeded by showing that the amount that will be needed, the amount of waste needed to fill the incinerator, won't be produced within a reasonable radius, because there'll be more recycling in 5 years and so on, and more organic waste collection. But of course, they come up with their trump card, which is, oh yes, but there's the commercial industrial waste, that'll fill it up, despite the fact that there's an obligation to collect that kind of waste separately. So, but there are possibilities of fighting it by showing that it absolutely isn't needed, and it's urgent to do it now before they're built, not after they're built and we have to feed them. In Sweden, surprisingly, they make their incinerators work in the winter and not the summer. I don't know how they manage.
Okay, are you happy with that, Mark? Do you want to come back?
With that, yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm not happy with it.
None of us are happy with that. Yeah. Okay.
I'm happy with the battle ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Claudia Beamish is next.
Yeah, thanks, Angus, and thank you for the presentations, which are very thought-provoking. I remember in the last Scottish Parliament session that, and Angus, you'll probably remember this as well, the evidence we took in what was then the Raki Committee about the circular economy, and it was stressed that a lot of the ways of dealing with things actually start at the design stage of things, and I'm wondering the degree to which there's any examples in other countries, or I'm sure there have been thoughts about this, but I'm wondering whether there's any possibilities of making it absolutely clear what things can be made of at the very start, whatever that may be, and it would be interesting to hear that, and also whether there are examples of of successful circular economy creation of jobs in other countries, which would relate to remanufacturing, particularly in quite large scale opportunities. I'm just wondering about those two areas.
John?
Yeah, I'll start with the fact that 60% of the material is going to the construction sector, so I'll just give an example from that one. There are now numerous examples of buildings which weigh half the weight, have almost double the energy efficiency, and have about 80% less carbon embodied in the building. And these there is no technological breakthrough needed to build. The only reason they've been built is they've been client-led.
Yeah.
So if the client wants something, that's good.
Yeah.
And in essence, there's only two ways to make that standard. One, you might hope that all clients ask for that, which is a bit of a fingers crossed approach, or you legislate for it. It's not going to come from UK government. They've pretty much abandoned all chance of legislating for the embodied emissions of buildings. But it is being taken forward at the city level in England, with Manchester, Bristol and London all potentially thinking of introducing some kind of legally binding targets. And those three cities represent a very large proportion of UK's current capital expenditure. So it really is almost a product standard that could be added to force the industry to do it. One of the biggest problems you have is that the industry is controlled by a limited number of big players who often have large lobbying power, and that's what's happened in the past. And they've basically said they wouldn't be able to meet certain targets around housing if you put those restrictions on them, and that led to the abandonment of some pretty decent policy in the area. But there are enough case studies now for us to push forward, and then the design of those buildings could have considerably less impact, and they should be less waste into the waste stream. So that would be my example.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, Richard. A couple of things there. Design is really important. It's one of the very first things you should try and do is to redesign products, or even design things out of service. But the reason there's not really anything in the consultation from the Scottish Government is that design standards for products are a reserved matter. So, and you can take a nationalist view on that, or you can just say, well, okay, so we've got to work with the UK government on that. But it's a frustration that one of the key tools in delivering a more circular economy, which is eco-design, better design, is not something we have very much control of. So we can do lots of secondary things. So we could stimulate eco-design courses at universities. We could create competitions and grant schemes to help people do design better. But we don't actually control the standards for products. We're kind of dipping our toe in the area that you mentioned, which is specifying what materials can be in things. So obviously we've got the plastic drinking straw ban and the plastic stemmed cotton bud ban, and we have done those in Scottish legislation. So there is, well, we are doing them. So there is something we can do to change products or to get certain materials out, but it's a complex area. I remember having a conversation about with the SPAD about we're thinking of doing cotton buds, but we have to work out if they're any made in Scotland, because if they're made in Scotland we can't ban it, but if they're not made in Scotland we can. So there's some crazy thing going on there which limits what we can actually do.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is on repair and reuse. I'm really keen on that, because again that's really near the top of the hierarchy. If you've got a toaster and it's broken, you can get another toaster for 15 quid in Tesco. Why would you take it somewhere to fix it? So let's change that financial message, and let's give us those facilities where someone will fix it for you, and that's the sensible and economic thing to do. And we have good examples, and the strategy, the circular economy strategy, making things last, that came out 3 years ago, says a lot of good stuff about repair, and it has some good examples. It talks about the remakery. A lot of people will know the remakery in Edinburgh. The bike station, that's a network of really interesting reuse facilities around Scotland with good social objectives as well. But I can't see the government really doing anything to encourage them, to mainstream those. So the government says these are great, but it doesn't say every town, even the smallest town should have a bike station or a remakery. That's what we should be going for. And whether we need something in the circular economy bill to enable that, or whether that's just a piece of policy that needs a bit of funding to get on and do it, I don't know. But we're not doing it. And yet that is really high up the hierarchy, is making sure people can get things fixed or learn how to fix them themselves.
And not forgetting in public procurement about possibilities of when stock is changed, putting it for reuse, refurbishment, and B, in some cases, using I think that there are cases where public authorities in France have used refurbished phones or something for employees.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious that Jenny Hume has been trying to get in for some time, but have you, is this related? Okay, Jenny.
Thank you. I'm borrowing your microphone. Thanks, my name is Jenny Hume from the Have You Got the Bottle campaign. It was a question to you, John. You mentioned that policy focuses on heating costs rather than aviation, and I just wondered if there's any good international examples of policy that aims to reduce aviation that we could be looking at here in Scotland.
No, there's an example in the news today of one which will do exactly the opposite, which will help reduce the costs of it. I don't think there is one country in the world that has an active policy on aviation, and as has been shown by numerous analysis, even with maximum technological efficiency in the aviation sector, it could account for up to 25–30% of the total global carbon budget within about 15–20 years. It's got to be talked about, and no one wants to talk about it. So I think it's an absolute, it's a real white elephant, and I think government's got to start that debate.
So that's a real opportunity for the Scottish Government to be a world leader.
Without a doubt. Yes.
And I mean, it was great because we decided not to increase air passenger duty recently, so I don't know if there's other examples of that around the world, but maybe that's a good start.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on aviation, but there is a lot of evidence on demand management and how it could be introduced. And I recognise in certain areas, extremely rural, that it may be needed. So this isn't a zero policy, but there is quite a lot of research on how you can demand manage it. You don't expand it as well, clearly. It seems to me there's this dual language of climate crisis and emergency alongside highlighting the economic benefit of aviation. And I think the whole thing about the future isn't about trade-offs, it's about supporting the sectors which will be part of the green economy, not trade-offs between the two.
Okay, of course, with regard to air passenger duty, I don't know if things have moved on today, but certainly this morning, UK government were talking about scrapping it to help flying survive, which, you know, strange logic. Sorry, the chap with the white shirt first, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, and then the guy with the...
So, Jack Barry, Zero Scotland. I'd just like to pick up on the interesting point you were making, John, around rebound, the rebound effect. And if things get more efficient, if your flights get, fuel becomes more efficient, or if your car fuel becomes more efficient, or if you're leasing clothes and it becomes cheaper, you end up buying more, and you end up flying more and driving more. So if we extrapolate this out across every product in the economy, if it's become more circular, how do you think, and this is a question to all three of you, how big is this effect, and how big is the problem, and how does Scotland avoid falling into the trap of that? And thirdly, do you have any examples of around the world where policies try to deal with this effect?
Yeah. So, the rebound effect is incredibly complex because in essence it's split into two ways of describing this. One, a household response to having more money available through increased efficiency, although car sales last year actually showed a reduction in efficiency overall of cars. So no problem with a rebound effect there. So there's a household response to it where either they may travel further or they might allocate that money to another unsustainable activity such as aviation. And that has been calculated quite accurately through pretty extensive reviews, and it's anywhere between 20 and 50% rebound. There's also like a comfort value which you might want to rebound in some cases where you want people to live in a healthy environment and not live in a cold, damp home. The real issue is on the industry side. That's where the really large rebound sits, because basically households are not perfect economic actors, whereas businesses, you'd hope, would be more in that respect, but there's enough examples where they're not. But in reality, the rebounds there, if they can make efficiency gains, they will obviously try and turn that into increased growth and increased production and output. The way to get around it is simply to have targets. Because if you have a target, what you're in essence doing is saying, what is the maximum social and economic value we can get out of 1 tonne of carbon or 1 tonne of material? And if you stick by that target, you switch the rebound effect to be a negative thing to a positive thing. You change it so we're trying to get as much productivity as we can to get much value, but the actual target, is unnegotiable. And that's why I actually think you don't just need an emissions target, you need an energy demand target. Because otherwise, I think it will almost be impossible to deliver those reductions. People have tried to do it with price changes, so you can add the price on so that the product stays at the same price. That's another option, but for me, it needs to be led by a strict target for it to work.
Okay, and you wanted a response, Rich?
Yeah, so rebound effect is really important, and there are some examples where you would take some comfort from the fact it's not going to be a disaster. So there was a good study in, I think, Ayrshire, really detailed study of improving the energy efficiency of people's homes. So they were paying less to insulate their homes. They had more money in their pocket. 1 or 2 of them probably did take a foreign holiday, so their carbon footprint overall went up. But actually most of them spent that money in the local economy, so it was actually really good for the area. So sometimes the rebound effect can work for you. There's an interesting one coming, which is that we're probably just about at the point where if you're thinking of buying a new car, an electric car looks just as attractive as a fossil fuel car, because although they're expensive to buy, they're cheap to run. And if that trend continues and they get considerably cheaper than a fossil fuel car, then more people will buy cars or a second car, and more people will drive more because it's actually cheaper to do that. So although going for electric is clearly the right direction for climate change, actually the rebound effect might mean that people are driving more, and so that we need to be very careful of that one. And as John said, there are lots of different approaches you can take to that. But and obviously I would agree with him about targets being the overall thing. If you are trying to manage an overall allowance of carbon and materials, then everything you do has got to fit in with that. And so your plan that you develop for transport has got to work out how do we constrain that extra driving people might have done because electric cars are cheaper.
There are examples of where the consumption does reduce. For instance, clothing. I think there's been in the UK there's been a big thing about clothing, buying less, throwing it away, keeping it longer, repairing it. Certainly in France too, and clothing sales have gone down. I've seen in several different places clothing sales have gone down. Of course, this is a terrible thing because the economy is going to crash. So somewhere we're never going to get anywhere while we have the gross national product as the only indicator of the well-being of populations. That was one thing, and the other what was it, the second thing? Yes, for cars, there are, well, certainly in France, the young people are actually less keen now on actually owning a car, and they're willing to try out these systems of co-ownership, or and the blah blah car, which is car sharing, or saying I'm going here, does anyone want to come with me? It's really taken off, especially with train strikes. That's really good for that. So I think some things work.
Okay, thanks. And if you could maybe say who you are, if I haven't introduced you.
Peter McCall from here representing Relay Network. And I want to say a couple of things. The first thing was it's a circular economy bill, and it would be good to have a focus on the economy, which I think is going to be a really important part of this. And I was wondering about things like creating obligations for the development agencies, Scottish Enterprise, Islands Enterprise, to do things in the circular economy, because there's a real opportunity here to do effectively import substitution to grow lots of jobs in the domestic economy, doing things that are not importing emissions and products, and that will actually generate those multiplier effects in local economies in a way that's really effective. And I think that's one of the big opportunities around this, is that if we can direct what we're doing towards the economy, then we can begin to build something that's actually quite resilient. And I think that's really important. The second thing I wanted to say was around data, particularly. Not so much the emissions data, but the data around what assets we have. And one of the things that I think government should be doing in the 21st century is curating really effective data about what exists, what's going into the waste stream, so that people can understand what that could be used for. Things like a schedule for every building that's going to be demolished, identifying what's in the building so that it could be reused elsewhere. These are the sorts of practical things that could really divert waste from landfill, could try and drive up some of the resource value that we've got out of things that are being demolished, if we indeed need to demolish them. And I wanted to make a third point, which is around design, which I think the Scottish Government could use its procurement to drive design decisions. That would be one way in which Scotland could make those decisions. I think would be a really valuable one. And I'm really concerned about, there are all sorts of things that you can do in design terms. You tend to have a large market to do it. And if only there were a sort of multinational organisation that could create those sort of regulations that we could be a part of, that would be fantastic. Unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction on that, and I did wonder about some of the opportunities for Scotland to bind itself to those EU regulations where they apply to design in future, because I think that would be one way to tie ourselves to an international standard that allows us to drive up those standards in a way that I think would be very difficult for a market of 5.2 million people to do. You know, we can say, don't make your mobile phones unrecyclable, everybody will ignore us. I think if the European Union do that, then there's a real chance that will happen. So just a couple of points I wanted to make.
Yes, I agree. We definitely need a stock model. The material flows just shows what comes in and what goes out. I've tried to build one before in my spare time, but I've never really had the data for it. But I've tried to get hold of sort of bills of quantities over years to get a sense of stock in the system, so you'd be able to do that. And with digital technology, it'd be very easy. That's not beyond the scope of possibilities, without a doubt, but it would need someone to initiate it. I can't see it happening otherwise. So I think a stock model is really important for it. Yeah, well, there you go. So I agree. On terms of the business ones and actually reducing imports and in domestically dealing with it, interestingly, that could increase territorial emissions, but overall reduce consumption-based emissions. Hence the importance of consumption-based emissions, because then you get a true sense of the policy with that. And in driving the businesses, I do feel sometimes that we're more willing. We want to support the businesses on the recycling, but we haven't done enough innovation on increasing the businesses which would use the recycling products, and I think that's a major problem. I think that's a huge innovation question. And I think I've answered most of your questions. If I haven't, someone else surely will.
Richard?
Thank you. So on the economy, I agree, and the enterprise agency is really important. There's a quite interesting partnership at an early stage between SEPA and Scottish Enterprise, looking at lots of things, but including innovation in product design. So that's got good potential. We'll see where it goes. But that also plays into the just transition agenda. So mostly we've been talking about North Sea oil jobs and what happens to them, and that's really important. But if you work at Grangemouth, if you work in one of the big plants at Grangemouth, you're either making stuff that becomes plastic, and there's a lot of pressure to do less of that, or you're working in a refinery, which is making petrol and diesel for people to drive vehicles, which in the future will be electric. So we need a future for those people. And so the circular economy linked to just transition is really important in those areas. And so I think, yes, we need to make sure those are joined up. If you talk to government about, yes, let's think about the job consequences. So the DRS scheme, for instance, will produce a large quantity of really high quality materials. It would be a tragedy if all we did was put those on the open market and they went 500 miles to England to get recycled. It would be a real shame if we did not create the facilities in Scotland. And there does seem to be work going on that. I was talking to civil servants today about that. There are lots of complexities about how much you can actually compel people to reprocess something in Scotland, for instance, but there are at least lots of side ways in which they are trying to make that happen. So yes, getting a good economic story is really important. And procurement and design, that's really interesting. Obviously the Scottish public sector spends some billions every year, and the fact that that's in the consultation for the circular economy bill is really promising. It's maybe the most fundamental thing that's in there. And in one sense, a bit of a cop-out for government, because they control the public sector, so of course they can tell the public sector to do something, and that leaves the private sector to do anything it likes. But it is still very important, and it is some billions of pounds. So, and I haven't thought of trying to drive design through that. That's really interesting. As you suggest, there are European moves. There's an eco-design directive, and there's a lot of work on design in Europe. But because it's mostly reserved, we would have, and it may get caught up in dodgy trade deals that the UK is doing, it might be quite a big fight for Scotland to try to keep up with Europe on some of that when the rest of the UK might not want to. But it's a good one to have a fight over.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. John?
Did you change?
Oh, sorry, no.
No.
Well, I am very concerned about the potential standards that could be lost, and I think obviously the public in Scotland are obviously very clear on their position on whether we should leave or go, and in my respect I was hoping that Scotland could be a really strong voice for maintaining those standards, because I think there's going to be a massive battle now around this, and I think in essence those standards aren't even high enough by a long way. So if anything, I think it's the Scottish Government who could take that fight, because I think we're up for an absolute shitstorm.
I think it's fair to say we're going to do our best. Anyone? Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the North Sea comments that you were making there. So you mentioned that there's some key trends that are moving towards reduced demand, with electrification of transport and energy and so on. And I think all oil producing nations are really banking on peak demand and saying, well, we'll keep producing as long as people are buying it, but eventually they'll stop buying it, so that's the plan. But do we not also have a responsibility to reduce supply? I mean, supply is ultimately what dictates price as well, and we don't really take responsibility. We've talked about consumption emissions and we've talked about territorial emissions, but we haven't really talked about export emissions. And the truth is while every country consumes oil, it's a relatively few number of countries that produce it. And I'm from Canada, where we produce a lot of it. And we're not planning on stopping producing it. We're actually planning on producing a lot more of it because people are willing to buy it. It seems like a bit of a tragedy of the commons, and I wonder, is it time for a country to take a stand and have an absolute target for reducing production?
Yes. It would be nice if it was us. We, for SDF and some other groups, produced a report called Sea Change before the summer, and that's largely about the just transition and the other jobs that people could be transitioning into, and how many jobs it really is in the North Sea that need to transition, because some workers will be retiring, some workers will be working in decommissioning, for instance. So it's largely about that, but it starts from the premise that there is a certain amount of oil left that is our fair share and that we should be allowed to take out. And so that's something that we'll, certainly as Friends of the Earth, will be doing a lot more on, is the idea that we need to agree an end date, and to us that's 5 or 10 years, not 20 or 30 or 40 years, as the industry likes to think, or we agree a budget, the amount of oil left that we can take out, so not the 20 or 30 billion barrels that the industry says is still there, but a much smaller number, and it might be 5 or 6, or there are different ways to calculate it. But absolutely, as an oil-producing nation, which says it's taking the climate emergency seriously, we need to conquer that. And it's one of our very biggest contradictions. John talked about contradictions where, on the one hand, you take the climate emergency seriously, but on the other hand, you do something crazy. And absolute denial that the oil industry is fine forever is our particular bit of climate craziness. And the industry's done a terrible con recently. They felt the pressure, so they've had to come up with a roadmap for the future, roadmap to 2035, and they've had to put some environment stuff in it. And so they've said, we will become the first net zero oil producing basin in the world, which means they will put up wind turbines next to oil rigs, and the energy they use to take out the oil, they will get from renewables. So the 3% of the energy that's involved in oil production, in the oil system, which is to do with production, they will make that zero. But the 97%, which is to do with burning the fucking stuff, that's someone else's problem. Nothing to do with them.
Okay, on that point, was there someone over here who was wishing to ask it? Oh yes.
Yeah, I'm Phoebe Cochran from Scottish Environment Link. It was really picking up on the eco-design point again, and I wondered whether one option we might have is through EPR schemes, and I wondered, Penelope, I don't know if you could comment on whether in the plethora of EPR schemes in France, any have managed to incentivise design and eco-design through sort of effective modulation of fees. And there was another question I had, was to do with repair, and the repair agenda, and again, probably maybe directed at Penelope about experiences from France or maybe any other countries you know. Are there examples of where countries have taken a more sort of proactive step in sort of pushing that area forward and coordinating it maybe, or even making it part of the obligation of local authorities or municipalities alongside the recycling work?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, I went a bit quickly through it because the time was short, but yes, I do think that that is one of our hopes, that EPR schemes can lead to better design. Well, right from the beginning, that's what we thought. It's logical if the producer is being made responsible for the life of what he or she is producing. It should be obvious that it needs to be eco-design. It doesn't work quite as simply as that. But to take the example of packaging, there are quite heavy. There are already quite heavy extra, not fines, but malus on non-recyclable packaging. There's an example of the opaque PET bottles, which came out a couple of years ago for milk, which, I mean, they're not necessarily inherently non-recyclable. They have no recycling. They have no existing recycling setup, and there was a bit of a fight about that, and it ended up them having to pay a lot extra to put these bottles on the market, which were not at that point recyclable. So so things can happen. That's a very simple one. I think for electronic goods, we're hoping that there's a lot more that can be done through repairability. There's the example of SEB. The SEB, you know, who produces, no? They produce things like beaters and coffee grinders and so on, which the French use a lot. And they have been becoming quite proactive about making their products repairable, and they're making it into an asset, and it's giving them a competitive advantage. And so once you get one producer, a large producer, going that way, it can kind of pull the other ones. I'm not sure I'm quite answering the question, but it's an interesting example, I thought. And the repair agenda, yes, again, it's local authorities very often. It's hard to know on a national level how to do it. But we in this last bill, we have at last achieved the fact that some of the money, the 1.2 billion euros a year, a little bit of that is going to go to the repair sector. That's the money collected for the EPR scheme.